You take a sip of wine at dinner tonight. Your face warms, your shoulders drop. Somewhere behind your eyes, a small, familiar looseness begins to spread. You know exactly what is happening. Ethanol is crossing into your bloodstream, slipping past the blood-brain barrier, slowing the exact neurons responsible for caution. You have a word for it, a chemical diagram for it, even a blood alcohol number for it. But for almost all of human history, nobody had any of that. They just had the feeling. And the feeling was terrifying enough that entire civilizations built gods, spirits, and medical systems just to explain it. Because here is the strange part. Before anyone understood fermentation as biology, getting drunk didn't look like chemistry. It looked like possession. Start with the Egyptians. They had one of the oldest documented relationships with alcohol on Earth. And one of their most important religious festivals was built entirely around getting deliberately, catastrophically drunk. It was called the Festival of Drunkenness, held in honor of the goddess Sekhmet, a lioness deity who myth said had once come dangerously close to destroying humanity in a rage. The story goes that the sun god Ra tricked her by flooding a field with beer dyed red like blood. Sekhmet drank it, believing it was blood, and fell into a stupor deep enough to save the world. So when Egyptians got drunk at this festival, they weren't just relaxing. They believed they were reenacting a divine rescue, temporarily letting a violent goddess take over their bodies and then pass out inside them, the same way she once passed out and spared humanity. Waking up hungover wasn't a punishment. It was proof the ritual worked.
Now, travel to ancient Greece, where drunkenness had its own god entirely. Dionysus wasn't just the god of wine. He was the god of a very specific kind of altered consciousness the Greeks called enthusiasmos, literally having a god inside you. When someone got drunk during Dionysian rites, ancient sources describe it less like tipsiness and more like a takeover. The self stepped back. Something else stepped in. This is where the modern word enthusiasm actually comes from. Not from excitement, from the belief that a spirit had entered your body and was now steering it. But not every culture explained it with spirits. Some explained it with plumbing.
Hippocrates and the physicians who followed him built an entire medical framework around 4 bodily fluids called humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was balance. Illness, emotion, and yes, intoxication were all explained as fluids sloshing out of proportion. Wine, in this system, was believed to heat the blood and thin it, letting it rise more easily into the brain and flood the seat of reason. Drunkenness wasn't a spirit possessing you. It was your own blood literally overflowing into your skull, drowning your judgment from the inside. A physician might have told you, quite seriously, that you were drunk because your blood had become too hot and too thin to stay where it belonged. Here's the part that should stop you. 2 completely different explanations. One says a god enters you. One says your own blood misbehaves. And they were both, in their own primitive way, groping towards something true. Alcohol really does cross into the brain. It really does hijack the part of you that makes careful decisions. Ancient physicians had no neurons, no receptors, no blood-brain barrier in their vocabulary, and they still built a working metaphor for exactly what modern neuroscience would later prove. Alcohol suppresses the prefrontal cortex, the same region responsible for impulse control and self-monitoring, while amplifying the effect of a calming brain chemical called GABA. The self-stepping back the Greeks described isn't mythology. It's your prefrontal cortex going quiet. They were right about the mechanism and wrong about the cause, which is somehow more impressive than if they'd been wrong about both. Cross an ocean, and a different culture arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion without any contact with Egypt or Greece at all. The Aztecs had an entire pantheon dedicated to a fermented drink called pulque, made from the sap of the agave plant. The deities of drunkenness weren't singular. They were plural, a group called the Senson Totochten, which translates roughly to the 400 rabbits.
Each rabbit god represented a different flavor of intoxication, from joyful and talkative to violent and reckless to mournful and weepy. If you got drunk and picked a fight, one rabbit god had supposedly answered you. If you got drunk and wept, a different one had. Drunkenness wasn't seen as a single state at all. It was a possession lottery, and which rabbit showed up decided who you became for the night. The Aztecs even had strict social rules limiting who was allowed to drink pulque and how much, precisely because they took this possession seriously. Letting the wrong rabbit in at the wrong time was considered genuinely dangerous.
Farther north, the Norse told a stranger story still, one that tied drunkenness directly to genius rather than chaos. In Norse mythology, a being named Kvasir was said to be so wise that no question could stump him. When he was killed, his blood was drained and mixed with honey, brewed into a mead so powerful that anyone who drank it became a poet or a scholar. That mead passed through several hands, guarded, stolen, and eventually hoarded by the god Odin himself. The myth doesn't separate wisdom and intoxication into two categories. It fuses them. To the Norse, that particular loosening feeling wasn't just your judgment slipping. It was, in their telling, literally a wise man's blood working its way through you, and a good mead slip could make you briefly brilliant rather than briefly foolish. Notice what's happening across every one of these stories. Nobody is describing a chemical reaction. They're describing a transfer. Something enters you, and something in you steps aside. Whether that something is a goddess's rage, a rabbit's temperament, a dead man's blood, or overheated fluid rising into your skull. The vocabulary changes by continent. The underlying intuition doesn't. Now go further back, before Greece, before Egypt, before writing itself, to a question biologists are still arguing about today. Why do primates like ethanol at all? There's a theory proposed by biologist Robert Dudley, sometimes called the drunken monkey hypothesis. The idea is that for millions of years, your primate ancestors ate overripe, fermenting fruit on forest floors, fruit that naturally contained small amounts of alcohol as a byproduct of yeast breaking down sugar. Following the smell of ethanol was actually a good survival strategy because it reliably led to calorie-dense, ripe food. Over evolutionary time, this theory suggests, those ancestors may have developed a built-in attraction to the smell and taste of alcohol, not because natural selection wanted them drunk, but because it wanted them fed, and alcohol happened to be the signal. There's real genetic evidence that fits alongside this. Researchers studying the ADH4 enzyme, one of the proteins your liver uses to break down alcohol, found that a mutation appeared in the ancestors of humans, gorillas, and chimpanzees roughly 10 million years ago, right around the time those ancestors began spending more time on the forest floor, where fallen fruit ferments. That mutation made the enzyme 40 times more efficient at metabolizing ethanol. In other words, long before anyone brewed anything on purpose, evolution had already started building bodies that could handle alcohol, because bodies that could handle a little ethanol could handle the fruit lying on the ground. So by the time humans figured out how to ferment grain and fruit deliberately, sometime around the Neolithic period, they weren't inventing a taste from nothing. They were domesticating an attraction that was already millions of years old, and then building explanations to make sense of what it did to them once it got strong enough to notice. That's the real twist here. Every civilization that developed a story for drunkenness, whether a goddess sleeping off a rage, a god stepping into your body, or blood overheating in your skull, was trying to answer the same question you'd ask today after one strange night out. Why don't I feel like myself right now? The answers were wrong in their details, and startlingly right in their shape. Something outside your normal control had taken over a specific part of you. They just didn't have a word for prefrontal cortex, so they reached for the only vocabulary they had: gods, spirits, and fluids. Which brings it back to you, tonight, at that dinner table. When your face warms and your guard drops, you're not experiencing anything new. You're experiencing the same event a Greek worshiper called possession, the same event an Egyptian priest called reenacting a goddess's mercy, the same event a physician explained as your own blood rising too high. The chemistry has a name now: GABA, ethanol, prefrontal cortex, blood alcohol concentration. But the sensation is exactly what it always was. Some part of you steps back, and for a little while, something else is driving.
Maybe that's why the feeling never fully lost its strangeness, even with a full scientific explanation sitting right next to it. You can know precisely what alcohol does to a synapse and still feel, in the moment, like some other version of yourself has taken the wheel. Ancient humans didn't have the biology, but they weren't wrong about what it felt like. They just called it a god instead of a chemical. And honestly, some nights, the god feels like the more honest name.